The generational leap for many established franchises in the early 90s posed a daunting challenge for both companies and developers alike. The vast ocean of possibilities with new hardware partnered with equally daunting expectations must have been choking, and Mega Man was subject to it all the same. Thankfully, I'd say the cult classic status of Mega Man X stands tried and true in the face of the hardships that popped up during its inception, and likewise deserving of additional credit for the competent evolution of its formula into one that's much more advanced, experimental, chock full of extra choices and longevity. I'd recommend playing this game before watching this video if possible. With that out of the way, I wanted to start by looking at the initial reveal of Mega Man X1 from the time of release. In terms of commercials, there's a surprisingly negligible amount. One would think the marketing budget for this game would have had higher priority for Capcom, but it was fairly unceremonious in its advertising. All that seems to exist is this one flashy commercial, and it was exclusive to the Land of the Rising Sun. As with many commercials from this time, it didn't do the best job of representing how the game itself works, but its main purpose, that being getting heads to turn, was the goal sufficiently reached. The animation is at least well crafted. The last thing you'd find someone saying about this commercial is that it was lazy or ignorant of what Capcom wanted to do with this new spin-off series. Things look rather grim and chaotic, with surface-level glances of game clips accompanying a rather dire situation. Huge explosions and rampant destruction are responsible for setting the scene. Us here in the West managed to get a glimpse of what was to come, thanks to the near-sole efforts done by GamePro's Episode 5, which came with some stereotypical 90s styled glazing at type.
The real world, but in the land of Mega Man X, anything can happen, and usually does. Super Nintendo's new Mega Man X is the mega masterpiece we've all been waiting for. It's one of the best SNES side-scrollers ever.
GamePro's magazine then published a page featuring more information based on the game's early prototype, as shown with this radically different and overbearing armor X is donned with, right next to screenshots of the iconic highway stage and another that didn't stick around for the final release. Same goes for two new robotic sidekicks, RX and RY, and whatever the words, and the new special head-on attack were meant to entail. Effectively, this half a page of text represents a few snippets of game information amongst hype for the new generation, while remaining rather elusive in what the game has in store. Any intended mystery, I think, can be equally filed under apprehensive elaboration stemming from uncertainty on the developer's intentions, or also wanting to leave readers with an allure of possibilities, thanks to the still developing game. Upon release, a proper preview of the game would be available thanks to both of the cover arts and manuals offering a deeper look. The Japanese box art front shows all of the 8 Mavericks alongside the main villain and our 2 forefront protagonists, with Vile surprisingly getting canned in favor of a very generic mini-boss that hogs a ton of space for itself. The characters are drawn well and have appropriate poses, but their placements and angles are peculiar. Most Mavericks decided to look off into the distance towards who knows what for a photo shoot they only did one take of. There's this weird yellow beam here to the left with an unknown origin and purpose, only adding more clutter than anything, and this glow around a derpy Sigma being off-taste. Our main villain looks like he's greeting an old friend. This art amounts to little more than a colored rough draft. The back is a notable improvement, featuring action set pieces from the game, and X in one of his most iconic dynamic poses. Mega Man X, the latest superhero is born. The back description here doesn't state anything worth typing out the translation for. I'm just thankful it's not a cluttered collage. The Japanese manual we'll be looking at is a girthy booklet packed to the absolute brim. The information and presentation is equal parts substantial and polished. Here's practically anything most would want to know. Time for a lightning round. Here's our prologue and the 2 most crucial characters to our plot, character bios for X, Sigma, Zero, and later Vile, 2 pages for the charge shot and wall kick, a description of each armor part and their abilities, what each main menu option does, what all functions on the stage select screen do, info on the main UI you'll see both during gameplay and while in the weapon select menu, with more info on the password menu and continuing, not only a page dedicated to item pickups, but also how much of each size restores with button remapping, weapon cycling, and the sound test likewise being covered. The next 8 pages then cover all 8 Mavericks, and every single one of them gets a unique description detailing a mix of their origin, reasons for joining Sigma, their personality traits, where they're stationed in the world, and their respective duties as Mavericks, with the bottom of each page displaying and explaining their respective special weapon, and the top left of every sheet giving them a cool nickname. At the end of this we have some enemy art and extra game advice to close things off, concerning stage effects, pointing players to use special weapons if bosses are too difficult, and reminding players to write down passwords or venture through branching paths within stages in order to find more collectibles. Back to an earlier page, it's worthwhile to say how even so something game knowledge obsessed as sub-tank details gets explained. 1 unit is filled for a small life energy drop, and 2 units for a big one, with each unit in a sub-tank equal to 1 unit on excess life bar. The amount of info here is insane. It's closer to being a full-on guidebook and is desperately missing in many discussions about Mega Man X. If this video convinces anyone to play this game, this booklet is all anyone really needs. I have practically no complaints. It receives a firm A+ from me. The American box art features a dedicated still from a single stage, instead of a multi-character portrait, with only Mega Man X and Launch Octopus taking center stage. A closer look at X when compared to the earlier American box arts for this series shows that the artist decided to adhere to the past lineage of babyface syndrome that was picked up years ago. It's both fitting and out of place, since this sequel series does make X the younger robot, but X's design is intended to lean more towards Sierra's teenager, instead of optimistic hero boy. While X here has some questionable aiming, he's way off the mark if a miscolored Launch Octopus was the intended target, the landscape is drawn fairly well, and X takes a good dominant presence with his shiny armor and a nice touch of his left foot sticking outside of the boundary box to help attract more viewer attention. The very experimental and unappealing title colors take this art down a notch. The gradient of blue to green to yellow within the letters, which are surrounded by red, create an eyesore. Our back for the American box art is rather uneventful and standard. The paragraphs here only stand to summarize the premise of the adventure. I suppose this one blurb of text is amusingly written. 12 megs, featuring 12 levels of action. The English manual is just alright. It's just okay. It's got half the page count with a third of the information of the Japanese version. Contents in their presentation have seen a sharp downgrade. The layout, character art, and amount of information is now second rate, with an interesting exception in the form of Dr. Kane's notes that are exclusive to the American booklet. For as substantial as the other manual is, their presence here is questionable, and yet very welcome. They're written aptly to the point it feels like cut dialogue from the final release. The context of Dr. Kane discovering X is a well-written collection of journal entries that should have made it into the final game, alongside the initial game's cutscene, even if purely in a text format. The flavor text present in the manuals is missing when most discussions concerning this game's story arise, but I can also firmly say such supplemental info doesn't add much value to making the story better. Rather flawless with an occasional high, unrevolutionary, and mildly anemic is how I would sum up the plot. Mega Man X, the character, serves as the biggest sore spot narratively I find. He was the biggest waste potential to prop up the story, ironic considering the message this tale aims to deliver. While X throughout gameplay is certainly made wildly more capable, he's somehow a blank slate that mostly has events happen around him. Any physical improvement across this adventure is shockingly not paired with a change in attitude, demeanor, maturity, or even basic display of emotions. There's little to emphasize or relate to for this coming-of-age story. X is propped up as this unfathomably capable creation that seemingly isn't bound to preset ideas of what a robot is. Much more human than what inorganic material should be capable of, that was sealed away due to his capabilities, requiring decades of extraneous testing while in a chamber so he could be judged ready to join the world. This is his first Greenhorn grand adventure, one where he gets saved from the brink of death by his fellow comrade, meets his creator for the first time, with a representative hologram that displays how Dr. Light initially wished X could choose his own path in life, but knows he must now resort to upgrades catered to him in order to save the world from peril. Then, finally, extraneously, manages to avenge his fallen comrade, having vanquished multiple nefarious and destructive plans across many parts of the world, and takes down Sigma alongside his entire fortress, having banished it to the depths of the sea. The following is the entire script X has for this game. He says, "I guess I wasn't powerful enough to defeat him," when saved by Zero during the first encounter with Vile. For the closing cutscene, we have a tiny glimpse at his thoughts of the adventure, with how he wonders if there was another way instead of fighting, while expecting to face off against Mavericks again in the future before he finds his answer, basking in a melancholic tone. Kind of a nothing character, isn't he? A possible position to stand with is one that argues for X's dominant story function being that of a player vessel. The player is inserting themselves into a story, and both executes desires and actions in ways that includes them symbolically. This comes as a thinly veiled apologetic counterpoint for the disproportionate lack of dialogue X has when put side by side to all the other characters with speaking roles. What immediately defeats this argument is how well connected he is to other characters before this game even starts, not people the player chooses to make bonds with. A character like Dr. Light has already made a notable history to pull from. X also lacks an adjustable personality, ranging from having no meaningful branching decisions made within story beats, or even something as simple as being able to make a custom file name. Another possible claim to make is putting X as this strong and silent protagonist, but such a stance is also made moot, since he's established to actually say anything with the initial face-off with Vile, showing the writer's willingness to have X speak at all, which if X was going to have any dialogue to say, it was better saved for parting words with Zero, or beating Sigma in the end. I should emphasize that me criticizing Mega Man X's story this much for having a milquetoast hero isn't a huge issue in the grand scheme of things, since the rest of the plot plays out fine without hassle. I've just come to question why the main character is little more than a good-hearted action figure. The rest of the in-game story we have offered is a solid supplemental reason to see the adventure through, with the other main characters wearing their purposes on their sleeves. A standard black and white heroes versus villains affair. All possible information to glean from the manuals is nice yet thin, doing little to add intrigue or immersion for the adventure, since all of the Mavericks can be simply labeled as just Maverick hunters that flip sides, and those with an evil plan we have to put a stop to. A footnote is that someone by the name of Dr. Kane is effectively the grandfather to the Reploid-dependent scene of this world, since he was the one who discovered X in his capsule in an archaeological dig, while using Dr. Light's design notes to advance robotics so swiftly, but he doesn't show up anywhere in-game. The story for Mega Man X has been given worthwhile emphasis thanks to its much grander scope when put side by side to the NES titles, but also due to Dr. Light's memo and X's analytics before the title screen even plays. A dark, static, black background is the canvas for the simple text on screen for a futuristic computer terminal. We also start with a very straightforward and punctual overview of some of X's specifications. Rather quickly, an overbearing text sound and alarm blaring help bring weight to simple text going upwards on screen, detailing Mega Man X as this great force with equal potential to do good and evil, and presumably unstoppable given things go awry, and if he ever were to harm a human. His creator's dire thoughts put stress on his proper sealment, and how necessary it is to confirm X is ready, as his ability to think for himself puts him in a grey line of fate, equally possible to bear great possibilities and great risks. X's potential is not to be taken lightly. The later demo screen showing off gameplay only has footage of X in Armored Armadillo's stage. As with standard practice of the time, this served as the attempt to hook people into playing if the game was just left running before starting. The developer playing showcases pretty much every notable aspect of the main gameplay. Dashing, jumping, killing enemies, abilities of each armor piece, effectively the essentials of what this game has gameplay-wise. They go through the stage at a bit of a slow pace, even though X has the dash, due to wanting to show off many different weapons. You won't see it here, but they eventually use a sub-tank, since there's only so much I can bring myself to say about this attract screen. I've cut it short to reduce dead air. The one thing surprisingly not showcased is the collection of a permanent upgrade, since this X is already fully powered up, even though they are such an integral part of the game. A greater focus on story and characters was also one of the many ways this new Mega Man series would differentiate itself from its older brothers, likewise with the first level to play, that being the highway intro stage. This game would establish a franchise staple of having an introduction that serves as the warm-up for what's to come. After all this time, it's hard to not state what hasn't been said ad nauseum. The intro stage to Mega Man X has good reason to be as iconic as it is, with readily apparent ways of teaching players the base mechanics organically, besides the charge shot, which won't be hard to stumble into for anyone not in the loop. Many of the moments of guiding players towards mastery of the mechanics results in a good list of different challenges. Part of it comes down to the enemy variety, since the intro stage has 3 unique enemies out of the 7 in total it shows off. Some enemies keep moving forward, and won't stop until they've hit a wall or fall into a pit. Some enemies can't be shot by just mashing and moving forward or standing still, requiring a charged blast or vertical movement to eradicate. Some enemies are pretty tanky, requiring a good beating before they explode. Some enemies surprise the player with their speed, only to stop right in front of them in the air. Some enemies constantly chase the player around, their cars continuing to move even after the driver is destroyed. It's a good selection of different behaviors present, amongst the few long jumps and demolished roads that keep things varied, and the developers made sure all of these ideas get roughly the same amount of screen time. How much challenge the terrain can pose is also a factor. Besides crushers destroying varying amounts of pavement, different gaps offer an unnerving, necessary leap forward to help players build that confidence of jumping in the face of instant death, while also showing that scaling walls will be a necessity. We have a well-paced level that has more than enough substance to keep people thoroughly engaged. I do think a few aspects of this stage are worthy of scorn, if only to try and help this analysis stand out amongst all the others. This very solid start isn't without its faults. The B mini-bosses could have used more health or invincibility frames. Alongside the machine gun attack they show rather limply. The range is shorter than a snake's arms. It could have added engagement by asking players to apply any effort to dodge the bullets, because currently, it's very easy to beat both of these Bs by just mashing shots. I don't know of anyone who has actually been hit by these turrets, especially more than once. Beating the first mini-boss also presents free energy right next to it, but it's pretty meaningless. The rather high drop rate for health pickups during this stage in particular is the sole reason this reward's inclusion is puzzling. It also should have presented some sort of challenge, so if this place was made harder to reach, and changed the reward to being a 1-up, it would have been much more enticing. The ship at the end deploying road attackers is a weird quirk with how the game won't proceed to Vile, unless enough cars are completely destroyed. Some players might not choose to go further than just neutralizing these as a threat, which can drag down the pace with no obvious way to proceed. All that aside, this first level presents very competent enemy placement and challenge diversity, with similarly strong Maverick stages to come. Alongside this game's cool motivator of the player being saved by Zero, saving them from a loss to Vile, and thus being the role model to aspire to. Even if a player is most avidly avoidant of story themes, if not outright illiterate, and only sees X being saved by Zero, this still sets up some really good payoff. It's applaudable that this was one of the pioneers in the organic teaching of game mechanics via plain level design and enemies, given the lack of established game design norms around this time, and this is all done without any intrusive text boxes to teach fundamentals. By now the game feel has been established a fair bit, which consists of an incredibly precise control scheme. The side-scrolling Mega Man games are known as some of the tightest feeling and responsive titles out there, ones that adamantly provided player freedom. Thus, the first Mega Man X game would follow through with the near-perfect controls its predecessors on the last console generation repeatedly refined and tweaked. As with the aims the classic series strove to achieve, controls in this game are similarly freeform and unhampered. Shooting and movement don't require players to wait for downtime for nearly any options, and both are completely left to the player's desires and capabilities. Features such as being able to set an exact jump height down to the pixel, and jumps being so non-committal thanks to forced momentum being absent, are some of what makes the side-scrolling series of platformers stand out from most others. Practically everything accomplishable as X is up to players to precisely time and execute. This leads me to one of the biggest additions of this game: wall kicks. Wall kicks are a brand new mechanic that allow for a complete shakeup to the Mega Man formula in terms of level design and enemy encounters. Instead of relying on ammo-dependent items or rush for a boost in height, all players need is a single wall to infinitely scale. This way, players can travel vertically without the reliance of ladders, leaping up ledges and cliffsides alike, or even prevent death to a bottomless pit with sufficient reaction speed. Platforming is now easier thanks to a mechanic that allows for more shortcomings in platforming prowess, but in a way that's still engaging and satisfying. Unlike the titles on the NES, the first level of a charge shot has also been given a worthwhile purpose. In Mega Man 4, 5, and 6, releasing a charge shot before it fully powered up resulted in something that didn't deal more damage than uncharged shots, even though it had a visual and auditory distinction. In the classic games, if the player wasn't constantly charging, they were typically at a plain disadvantage. Keeping a full blast ready at a moment's notice was just the best move too often, and so the mid-charge served no purpose other than presentation flair. Mega Man X gives it worth because green charge shots do more damage than lemons against regular enemies, while also having a piercing property added so it's easier to kill swarms and lines of pests without needing a full charge. This is alongside the notable buff it receives to its hitbox. Another element of big added freedom is in the form of a dash instead of a slide. The freedom this provides is noteworthy because unlike the slide, the momentum can extend into both jumps and wall kicks. Numerous hazards in platforming are, as a result, much easier to deal with. This is simply a move faster button that isn't limited by any resources. The added player expression with all these new controls is nicely supplemented by a customizable layout in the options menu, leaving the choice up to players to change it in adherence to any preferences. I can scorn the default layout for not putting the dash on the shoulder button by default, It should have carried higher consideration given how integral it is to this game, but that's my sole issue with it, which is fixable by players anyways. X's controls came with a few additional nitpicks. They're weird quirks sourced from very specific stage objects. There's only 2 notable moments where the controls for this game don't work as expected. Jumping off of the spiked boards with wheels in Armored Armadillo stage has momentum that's forced on players, when many other objects don't influence air movement similarly. It's particularly a nuisance when wanting to move backwards off of one that's making a mad dash in one direction. And then we have these specific floating platforms that interact with dash inputs weirdly. They ignore a dash input if the player initiates one while walking towards the opposite direction it's moving, but only sometimes. I have no clue what's going on here. It's weird to describe, and just as awkward to try and show off. One more small nitpick of the controls is the dash command overlap, which concerns tiptoeing thanks to the unchangeable double tap mapping. With dashing having a second method of activation, tiptoeing attempts might trigger it if they're done in quick succession, but since making tiny adjustments is far from ever necessary, and dashing by tapping forward twice can be easily cancelled by letting go during any frame, this is exceedingly rare as a legitimate issue. The expansion in an established control philosophy was done not only in several creative and innovative ways all at once, but also had no big mishaps, and thus is a big contributing factor as to what makes this game so fun to play. Now past the intro stage is the biggest designated chunk of content, which are the main 8 Maverick stages. This set of 8 levels comes with a pretty universal, unwavering mark of length, challenge, and quality that only varies slightly. It's head-scratching to point to a stage that isn't well considered, or adamantly stands taller than the rest. These are all well balanced with the developer attention they received. Diverse in their ideas, constantly changing from one presented challenge to another, and with very little downtime, all following a philosophy similar to the intro highway stage. We have an above average set of levels that do a good job accomplishing their goals, taking competent advantage of the controls and added power of the new hardware. The enemy roster for an adventure of this length is also quite remarkable. While sometimes levels emphasize vertical scaling for power-ups, secrets, or plainly different challenges. Looking at an empty stage map, it's not hard for me to recall roughly what happens and where. Placements and enemy counts I did are off the mark, but they're memorable enough that I don't hesitate with many of these. First in Boomer Kawanger, we go from the initial vertical climb with shielded enemies, then go into a laser section with enemies that float down, then onto more ladder climbing with these tortoise bombers, before entering an elevator with another type of flying enemy. Then it's onto the climb outside with enemies on top of ladders and parts of the walls jutting out, until finally coming to a close with more ladders mixed with hovering platforms and more turrets. In a single stage, I've pointed out about 6 designated sections with challenges different from one another, and if they're not made of unique assets, they've been mixed in a way different from previously. Spark Mandrill features some gun bolts at the start, and sometimes has sparks of electricity that race along the floor. Then there's the dark section with the Firefly enemies, the Water Blop mini-boss, the guys on wheels and ceiling turrets for this other section, some more big tortoises along the way, and ending with another lights out section. Flame Mammoth features junk robots that fall into lava, which transitions to this section here with fire pillars and pickaxe men, a section with returning junk enemies and crushers, and this last pipe section with a split path, some spinning green robots, mace shield guys, and lava leaking out of pipes. Since all of the main Maverick stages are executed similar to this, it comes down to what I see being a list of small design hiccups. To rephrase, what I see as issues are only moments amongst a solid list of finely crafted levels that could have used a bit more rounding to the rough ends. These enemies that whiz by in Spark Mandrill are not a good challenge, even if their damage is minimal. I'd definitely slow them down, or just give the player an actual telegraph, so there's moment-to-moment engagement instead of route memorization. Like a few other parts of this game, they serve as a reminder to use wall kicks as a worthwhile movement mechanic, but they quickly turn into a bland, uninteresting annoyance. Storm Eagle's stage is the least interesting and commendable of the main 8 for me, with a bland reliance on basic moving platforms. That's simply what most of this level's challenge revolves around. Platforms on rails, platforms that go up and down, other platforms that go up and down but are also attached to the ground, and others that fall after landing on them. Some plane enemies would have helped, especially given the runway background at the start, and the towers that exist here. You know, airport stage. The flying bird enemies that do exist are oddly exclusive to Armored Armadillo stage instead. Boomer Kawanger's stage has a pitiful amount of error even with the dash for these lasers in this early section. It's consistently hard to not set a single one off. This elevator set piece afterwards with spiked platforms is also too speedy, with enemies very likely hitting the player without a reasonable reaction window. The lanternfish's snakes needed to telegraph for what way they're going, or halved speed. This beam of light move also seems like cut content, because all it does is blow X away, if it's even activated. The serpent mini-bosses can also be too boring. I find it weird they don't shoot out missiles or anything out of their mouths. Both mini-bosses prior to this one have more going on than just swim around. Some of the rideable boards with wheels and armadillo can serve as newbie traps due to ending right next to a pit or line of spikes. I wish they had specific points that just self-destructed sooner harmlessly. They're a cool presentation, but ill-considered. Sting Chameleon's cave section with the falling rocks needed a longer telegraph for when the rocks are going to fall. Taking pot shots is sometimes just inevitable much of the time. Their low damage helps, but they remain annoying if you don't have the upgrade to nullify them. We've also seen a bigger focus of combat for this sub-series, in the form of much more common bigger enemies serving as momentary blockades, as many of their placements outright block progression until they're defeated. Big enemies like these were established as early as the first Mega Man game, but now they've seen a much more common and near universal presence across stages, instead of mainly being boss gate bodyguard big guys. When they present themselves, combat in this game turns into more of a pace halter than something that flows seamlessly with the level design, but they're simultaneously a competent inclusion to stop players from mindlessly dashing through an entire level in under a minute. Now that the level design of the main 8 stages has been covered, it's on to the climax for each stage with the boss at the end of every level. Without regurgitating a jump to new hardware speech, the boss fights in this game do a competent job considering the new wall climbing, since boss rooms account for hugging the top corner of a wall with hazardous ceilings, or the boss themselves can attack the player in some way, if they decide to be up there for too long. This way players can't just eradicate any challenge on a whim, by taking refuge 30 feet above. Let's take a look at Chill Penguin for our first examination. He's a rather swift and agile fighter, in spite of what his potbelly stature might suggest, capable of jumping to the ceiling with ease, for a leap forward, or to hang onto his hook in the middle for a blizzard storm. He can also slide around just as quick, bouncing off of either wall before standing up again. He also has the ability to shoot 4 either straight flying or sliding ice balls in a row, can conjure up spiky, damaging statues of himself with a freeze breath that can also stun the player, and these statues serve as both offense and defense. Their presence acts as an active damage zone that Chill Penguin is immune to, and they can be deleted by the player or some of Chill Penguin's own attacks. Okay, that's a bit of a shotgun of information. Point being, his moveset is very diverse, but also becomes very interesting with how his moves influence both the applicability of his statues and player decisions. All of these attacks have vastly different speeds and attributes, so they can quite easily overlap. What keeps this off from being overwhelming is how the statues can be in the player's favor, since Chill Penguin will always break them in accordance to his sliding or blizzard attacks. They can also be deleted by player shots, and his ice balls don't go through statues either. What makes this very fun to do is how even with each subsequent attack being random, all of his telegraphs are pretty lengthy, same for his recovery outside of moves. He can be quick, but he needs to get off his white behind first. He's always mixing and matching his attacks one after the other, and keeps things really reasonable. His fight is potentially really enhanced if we get a good RNG roll of his moves. Even at his most threatening, he's still perfectly doable. He's also the best fight in this game, and it's not even close. The following present a sharp falling quality. They all serve as mediocre to outright bad encounters. This tubby bird feels like a game design fluke if anything. Spark Mandrill is just okay, being the second best of a bad lot thanks to a fun enough moveset. What drags him down 2 notches is that he doesn't incentivize charge shots when his fight is built around them. He takes additional damage from charge shots, while the dash punch move is cancelled by anything stronger than a lemon. Players that prefer rapid firing won't easily come across these factors, making the fight harder than it was likely intended. Storm Eagle is a fight where the main strategy is holding down a single direction, until the chance to shoot him arises. Doing this over, and over, and over, and over again, has a sole exception with a barfed up egg that spawns birds. Unless he decides to use the Storm Tornado, which in that case it's holding down a single direction and jumping twice. Flame Mammoth is a very big opponent that fails to use his girth to his advantage. Any stomps that should have been always random in height are exceedingly easy to recover from, and both the oil shot out and the conveyor moving either way add almost nothing. Not sure why they didn't just copy and paste code from a particular mini-boss for this one. The work was already done besides a simple palette swap. This oil instead serves to slow down the player as much as a stiff breeze. There's also the spot right in front of him that completely invalidates most of his damage options. You really can't just stand here for long periods of time, irremoved of danger. Boomer Kuwanger is concerned with being a swift, frantic, and one-note character. All this fight will consist of is after images and throwing a boomerang, besides a rare launch to the ceiling. There's little depth, since his cool introduction is the only time he moves vertically. There's nothing remotely interesting like multiple after images, just simply the one, and it comes and goes at an unreactable speed. Sting Chameleon would have been alright due to his varied attacks, but he's held back severely by a dumbfounding camouflage. It makes him invincible and lasts several seconds each time. It causes so much dead air since this observation phase is rarely threatening. Even with sped up footage, you can see how long it takes to finally release a charge shot, only to keep waiting around. I've yet to point out the two most egregious bosses of this lot, with Armored Armadillo being one of two glaring design oversights. He has only two things that offer very little variety, while living up to his name in stride, and then some. Regardless of what type of charge shot he's hit with, he only ever takes 1 damage, but he also becomes vulnerable during confusingly short times. While he's shooting plasma balls, he deflects shots, but not always, and I never managed to figure out the reason as to why. He's a tank offensively as well as defensively, since contact damage with this boss will kill players with a starting health bar in only 3 touches. Launch Octopus somehow manages to be worse, being a ceaseless discharge of missile spam. Your fate lies in his hands, since his pattern of one-heal launch piranhas is unpredictable. One can only hope he never resorts to them, since sometimes they're just outright unavoidable. When he launches green missiles or spins around, the way of avoiding damage is rather boring. Players for this fight are so harshly dependent on luck, and possible brute forcing just to come out on top. All of the fights listed prior to this one don't require being lucky enough to win. I hope this is sufficient reasoning as to why I don't like almost any of these. They're unrelenting, unpolished, and untested ideas that don't win any awards. Each of these bosses will procure a new special weapon to mess around with once they bite the dust, which brings me to discussing their importance and viability. The special weapons iconic to Mega Man are back and made even more novel than when they first entered the scene. While the basic buster for X isn't lacking in performance, the special weapons potentially multiply this game's replay value, since Mega Man X introduces the idea of chargeable special weapons. Their general purpose, I believe besides tradition's sake, is to serve as another way to play the game. In this first outing, special weapons are mostly competent, which for those familiar with Mega Man titles prior to this one, should be aware of the spotty track record. Mega Man X1 sports, thankfully, arguably, the best special weapon set out of all of these games up until now, the sole competitors being either version of Mega Man 4. Overall, I think these special weapons are well considered with their design and execution more often than not, and most of the base versions of weapons felt like apt buster upgrades and side grades. This simply seems to fall on not only basic playtesting, but also since so many of these are adjustments to the standard blasts. Their speed, trajectory, or damage are all comparable or meaningful. A weapon like Fire Wave might be short range, but it can melt almost anything, carrying a wickedly high damage per second value that also has instant startup. The Horming Torpedoes lack speed and burst damage, but their namesake makes them worthwhile, since aiming can take a backseat in favor of focusing on other things, such as avoiding enemy attacks and platforming. The Chameleon Sting might have a small learning curve thanks to the startup it has being a bit peculiar, but its full potential can really shine once mastered, since the damage value per bullet is the equivalent of 2 uncharged lemon shots. The Boomerang Cutter might have the circular, limited trajectory it always fires at, but it travels rather quickly, while not spending any ammo for cutters that completely miss enemies and return to X, adding to its longevity. Players can essentially use what they want, and it'll get the job done. I would only mark the Electric Spark as a dud, although I haven't spoken on the charged versions of weapons yet. I find that charging most of these simply takes too long, the charge time hampering the pace of levels for something that ultimately isn't that cool or helpful. These charged weapons should have had a shorter charge time as the main change. Waiting for only the second level of charge instead of the current pink I think is plenty fair for what they currently provide. Either making these quicker to activate, or having longer lasting, more useful effects is a two-way street I'm fine with either way. The charged versions of Storm Tornado, Homing Torpedo, Fire Wave, and Shotgun Ice had practically no noteworthy combat or utility applications. These are heavily outclassed by most uncharged weapons. These in particular run oddly counterintuitive to this game's core design, since most combat is designed around a default horizontal moving blast. So Charged Storm Tornado, for example, avidly comes to mind only for very specific vertical sections in the place of the base version. Charged Fire Wave and Shotgun Ice are heavily dependent on smooth and downwards moving terrain when so often pits, ledges, and other breaks in the environment take place every 5 seconds. Even Charged Homing Torpedo, which is simply a faster shotgun version, takes longer to kill things due to the long charge time, and also ends up having a worse ammo economy. Chargeable special weapons are the result of an upgrade to the Buster, one part of a larger whole. This iteration of Mega Man is equipped with a brand new shiny armor, not only showing a more foreboding and fortified demeanor to our main protagonist, but also expands an established formula as a slew of permanent upgrades enter the fray. They allow the ability to dash on command for boosted mobility, reduce all incoming damage sources in half for added durability, expand the damage output by amplifying special weapons and expanding with an extra charge level, and also allow for the breaking of blocks with a headbutt. Certainly, not all of these upgrades are created equal, as the last one had the devs admit to feeling rather lost in what application it should even serve, thus the rather dull presence outside of aesthetics for the helmet. Heart tanks are also here. They hold within them the power to extend the health bar bit by bit, helping X slowly expand the ability to make mistakes, while sub-tanks take the place of traditional E-tanks. Sub-tanks are now permanent, refillable sources of extra health that can be triggered on command, but are only fillable by health pickups and stages, so now enemies and items have extra worth when before, these pickups would serve no purpose at max health. Health restoration is also so much more freeform, since E-tanks were consumable and only dropped in very specific stage locations. One never mentioned issue I take with the collection of these upgrades is a rather sloppy implemented lecture shoved onto players' faces, when it was mostly unnecessary. While sub-tanks and heart tanks work without any explanation, the armor parts fail to be the same. Dr. Light forcibly has players stop in their tracks so he can let off his little paragraphs, while the game keeps players locked until it shows off what each piece does. The kicker is how Dr. Light doesn't even explain how to actually activate these abilities with the controls, and just states their main function, so the point of being so restrictive is lost. There was absolutely no need to have obligatory pace-halting text, while also locking players to show them the purpose of these armor abilities, when most of them could have been shown in a much more organic way. This would be more of a minor problem in other games, but it babies players when the intro highway stage is such an iconic moment of game design for this era, and would have been better off properly teaching players how to use these armor parts, or swapping the current text for extra lore and story substance instead. This brings me to another good strength of the series, the replayability and character progression. The routing of past Mega Man games is back and hugely important. For reference, level routing consideration in Mega Man 4 only concerns obtaining one of 4 different utilities that all provided extra height, with 3 of these items being E-tanks that simply require a drill bomb. The wire and balloon adapters are in 2 different stages as dedicated collectibles, and both can be obtained at any time. All items listed here without symbols to the right of them can be simply picked up in the stages without affecting routing, and out of 22 noteworthy pickups, only 8 of them ask for power-up or utility usage. The visual information here I've made is readily apparent, with the minute exception of Rush Jet being acquired once 4 stages are complete. The lost potential here is how so many of these can be acquired with the default Rush Coil, since the balloon and wire adapters are merely extra novelties, besides the E-Tank and Cossack 3 needing some clever puzzle solving. Now, it's on to what the Mega Man X stage pickup list looks like. The Mega Man 4 map was something I made in a single day. The Mega Man X routing maps are something I've been questioning for months, and it's easy to see why. Mega Man X sports a whopping 8 heart tanks, 4 sub-tanks, and 4 armor capsules to locate and acquire. Granted, someone new to this game doesn't go out of their way to look up information and guides online, there comes the potential question of, what can a level order look like when routing a playthrough here? Well, let's see. First, we'll be looking at some hard locks for Mega Man X. Here we can see what influences consideration, and is used for the collection of upgrades, and any paths that come at a crossroads with others. The flowchart shows the dash boots being a mandatory hard lock for the entire armor, and many collectibles. If the dash boots are in the player's possession, they allow for much more freedom in stage selection, and equally so for character growth. Upgrades here typically only have one hard requirement. A combination of items is the exception to the norm. It's not hard to figure out what upgrades can obtain others with basic experimentation, which makes the flowchart easy to follow. But there's a few other factors to note, since this doesn't state item locations within what stages. Now it's on to stage pathing. The following is a route I think is close to optimal, considering backtracking, boss difficulty, and whatnot. Cho Penguin should absolutely serve as the first stage to do, always, with Storm Eagle and Flame Mammoth following thereafter. Both of these bosses are easy as base X, but going for the Helmet and Storm Eagle second saves the stage revisit to Flame Mammoth, since the Buster requires 2 upgrades, and that eliminates a backtrack. Next, a player could go to the rest of the stages in any order, since by now they have the dash boots, and are able to charge the shotgun ice with the Buster upgrade to collect everything else. I would personally advise leaving Armadillo and Octopus for near the end, since while thankfully their stage upgrades can be obtained whenever, the bosses should be tackled with a couple of health boosting upgrades or their respective weaknesses first. This least backtracking order requires just one mandatory stage revisit, which I think is indicative of a well thought out upgrade list. Acquiring the numerous upgrades necessitates solving brain scratchers, or platforming challenges, being a step further than a vast majority of the E-Tank and other collectible placements in older games, those being more often less engaging. A small nitpick arises with a few of these solutions coming into question with how intuitive they are. Players that don't experiment with weapons naturally won't have guidance or logical reason to find out that the Boomerang Cutter can collect items, or that they can summon a sliding ice block at will. While I'm somewhat fine with some of these more out there solutions, I can say the most puzzling and troubling one is the Heart Tank and Cho Penguin stage. It sits somewhere out of sight, that gives no indication of its presence, and the solution of breaking this part of the environment with the Fire Wave was ill-considered. I would have just put the Heart Tank in a simple ice block instead. The fact that multiple keys to locks are present is both pretty novel and thoughtful. I wish the sub-tanks and armor parts had more ways to obtain them, since multiple worthwhile solutions mostly exist for hard tanks, but it's a minor qualm to have. Some bigger fish to fry is the game inhibiting players from leaving incomplete stages at any point, because the boss needs to be defeated first. This puts a mild damper on the collection process, since players shouldn't have to repeatedly burn away their lives just in order to visit another stage for more items, especially when this upgrade collection process can be so involved and thorough for greenhorns writing down several notes. The rise of popularity of RPGs around this point in time led to all of these upgrades being added for that feeling of character growth, while done in such a way that feels organic, alongside not being mandatory, besides a single, solitary, odd capsule. This little pod here is responsible for being the Achilles heel to the original Mega Man X, thanks to poor foresight and sloppy intent. Okay, so in Mega Man X, the Cho Penguin capsule is completely unavoidable. It stands as the solitary upgrade players will come across if they play this stage. This placement ensures that everyone who seeks to complete this game gets a briefing on Dr. Light's in-universe intentions for a sealed away creation, while being shown how to improve X's capabilities with armor capsules. Playing all other 7 stages prior to this one, instead of picking this stage first in a playthrough, will show a significant difference in playtime. With finishing each stage once, and at a consistent pace, it takes approximately 25 minutes to complete all stages with Cho Penguin last, and it goes down to 17 if the dash is obtained as soon as possible. A near idealistic scenario like this proposes players don't visit other stages repeatedly due to mistakes or time-consuming exploration. It's quite the difference in playtime, showing how much faster X can traverse the game with the dash. The dash also carries with it significant ramifications outside of pacing. I think the main culprit to emphasize is how it carries momentum in the air with dash jumping, which the game flounders to accommodate. Mega Man X has a freeform stage select structure that's part of the franchise's core appeal, which means that every stage here has been catered to the default abilities. That means that there are no hazards or enemies that default X will find impossible to defeat. Collecting the dash and letting X do such a big, long leap forward is now the source of lost magic in level design. Many pits can now simply be dash jumped over with no worry of dying, when doing these hops dash lists would carry so much more tension and concern from the player. This same huge bound can so easily trivialize enemies that dash list X would be forced to engage with directly. Enemies meant to serve as hazards are now stepping stones with a rather simple movement option, the challenge of not receiving touch damage being negligible. This section here in Armored Armadillo can carry a good amount of tension from being forced to wait for the mets to pop up, but with the dash equipped, It lacks much of the same created worry in being instantly crushed by a robot decimating the cave's ceilings and walls. Setups and enemies can be rather easily nullified with dashing, and not to a degree I'm comfortable with. I urge any series veterans to do what I do, and limit themselves to only doing dash jumps for collecting items. After playing the main 8 stages this way, I think this is how one reaches a healthy medium with more fun movement and significantly reduced waiting time base X would deal with. Getting to the next challenge is so much quicker this way, but no dash jumps mostly eliminates the times X would normally slowly waddle forward with inferior grace, challenges still retaining much of their intended design and engagement. It kind of makes me wish the game was designed this way, since all that needs tweaking is little more than a few upgrade placements. I don't think the possible intention from the developers wanting to help ease people into this game by stripping the dash from the default moveset had good implementation, simply because the more time someone has to use a mechanic in a game, the sooner they're going to be familiar with it. People are losing out on more experience to be gained this way, on top of it not being remotely mechanically complex to understand. I'd easily argue several of the boss weapons are much harder to master. It's just a simple speed boost. Players aren't going to know where to obtain it unless they've been told about this location ahead of time by outside sources. There's also the fact how the right armor in Sting Chameleon lets players use the dash, and it ends up functioning the exact same. I want to make a comparison with another movement mechanic that was created with similar intentions, bringing variety to boss design and level ideology, while making the player character momentarily faster, and is also helpful when dodging hazards. I'm talking about the slide in Mega Man 3. Mega Man 3 never kept the slide from players since the beginning. This is what allows the game to have its freeform selection of 8 starting levels work without hassle, since mandatory 1-block tall gaps are commonplace, and both bosses and many enemy designs are also considered with this in mind. It's a mechanic that works without explanation, and is much better considered when level design and boss design are pointed to. Whether it's ball chain Joes, boss attacks, or one-way paths to levels, it's all been considered thoroughly. I can't say anything bad really comes to mind with the slide being introduced in this game, but I do think it would be similarly trivialized difficulty-wise if slide jumps carried momentum as well. This isn't even mentioning how half of the upgrades need the dash to get at all, and every boss is marginally easier with it too. The game doesn't truly start until the dash is obtained. For the debut of the sequel series, Mega Man X also didn't remedy the issue of players simply having too much weapon ammo at their disposal, which becomes all the more true when all weapons are acquired. So this is where one of the other biggest sins of this game resides. Without dying, I found that roughly 6 of the 8 default special weapons can get X through most of a stage on a single weapon bar, which, on top of half damage reduction, was way too much for giving players leeway for making the game easier. The game can be fairly easy once specific weapons and armor parts are obtained, coupled with heart tanks and sub-tanks to top it off. But I wouldn't say the potential character growth here completely trivializes the design. It's more so abusing certain options that stand head and shoulders above others. The base Storm Tornado and Charged Chameleon Sting are 2 of the biggest culprits. The earlier statement of most stages completable by a single special weapon energy bar does no service to explaining their awful balance. One of these weapons is a full-screen Spiral Wave of Death that has a ridiculous damage per second and active time, with very lenient ammo usage. Anything that isn't a Maverick boss or enemy with iframes stands no chance against this thing. The other is an on-command tool that makes the player fully invincible to being even crushed, and allows players to continue using the base version while the charged one is active. So not only is the threat of damage removed outright for anything, but an offensive option is still available simultaneously for some reason. The other point of contention concerns the max health X can have at its disposal. While X rightfully has a small health pool at first, classic Mega Man on average could make more mistakes out of the gate. The maximum amount allows X to have a coffer of extra juice. I think the fact that we have 4 sub-tanks is actually fine, since the amount of 4 doesn't really bother me given they need such a notable commitment to refill. The body armor is a true catalyst for reckless play. Here's how much health X starts with. This is how much he has with all heart tanks. This is how much he has with all heart and sub-tanks. And this is how much if you add the body armor. Something like this initially very treacherous vertical climb should not be possible this way, and it certainly doesn't come off as intentional. Showing such a treacherous climb brings me to talk about the conclusion to this game, which is with the final Sigma stages once all of the main 8 Maverick stages are completed. The cap off to the adventure remains, with a set of tough levels meant to challenge players in much more harder ways than previously, with boss fights befitting of this climax. They're also yet again one of my biggest issues with this game. The metaphorical train we've been on is running out of steam. It's here where the game does some difficulty jerking to try and account for a power difference amassed during the previous levels. There's quite a few rooms that are pretty demanding and put the player in several pinch scenarios, jam-packed with enemies that are put in specific places so that respawning is an avid concern. Thus, weapons other than the default buster are something that will likely come to players' minds, while not being strictly necessary if someone were to spend a lot of ammo in a single stage. I can't really commend the creativity or call these memorable, since there's no unique enemies at all, and there's a single room with bouncy springs as the only new level mechanic at play. The lack of new ideas makes this feel plain and dry when you compare it to the earlier stages as a standard. I wouldn't have been against the developers just recycling more past level ideas that aren't basic moving platforms, because aside from moments of tightly packed rooms with enemies making one stop and think for a moment, there's little else to chew on here. These levels feel underwhelming coming off the classic series, because while they were varied in quality themselves, we see that even dating back to Mega Man 1, one of the shortest titles in the franchise, it had more interesting and even more final stages. It sits at 4, while Mega Man X only has 3. Even wording it like this is a bit generous, since the third stage in Mega Man X consists of equal part boss refights and level design. That's another interesting subversion to this franchise we see here. Our boss refights in the final levels are astoundingly not jammed into one teleporter room. Instead of dumping the player with copy and pasted content all at once, the repeated content here is at least more spread out. It's not much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. I've never thought of the boss refights in Mega Man as anything but a lazy and uninteresting way of expanding gameplay length, failing to capitalize on potential surprises, and never remixing boss behaviors into something worthwhile. It's the same thing done here. The content is more spread out, but ultimately still rather lame. The freedom of choice we used to have has been simultaneously removed from what the teleport rooms do provide. This repeating of content shows the game being pretty compromised near the finish line, because looking at Sigma Stage 3 and the lack of a fourth proper stage, we have a room of enemies, a boss, 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 and then finally the actually unique boss. A proper fourth stage would have allowed for better pacing than what this game currently provides. The actually unique boss fights for the endgame leave me equally unimpressed. Going back to the game decently adjusting for a more capable X, I've noted down some damage values, which are pretty high. Damage taken from the Maverick fights hover around the 4 to 6 range for the higher end, generally speaking. The Sigma stage bosses though, they have a much higher average as seen here. 8, 8, 8, 10, 10, 10, 10. 12, 14. If I were stripped for any positive comments of the end game bosses, I think Rang Dabanga is the second best boss fight in the game. It uses an insta-kill floor that adds appropriate tension with a layout that gives players a good wall kick workout, while not being too stale. All of the other end game bosses are forgettable or pretty bad generally, and I never have much enjoyment with them. The refight with Vile is one that I don't like the first form of. While he was properly executed to be invincible during the intro stage, I think players could have stood to get some sort of dialogue reward if they beat him here, while having the outcome with zero sacrifice be the same in this round too, using this as an extra moment to commend the growth of X, because anyone remotely experienced will be simply tasked to drop the controller and take a swig of water, while this turns into a needlessly boring cutscene, since the fastest option to progress is just to take enough damage and not fight back. I also take issue with the fact that Vile's stun shots don't come out sooner. I still remember my first playthrough consisting of me wasting a sub-tank due to being so cautious and not wanting to die. When he's out of his mech, it amounts to a really standard fight. While it does push players to be careful and repeatedly exercise the dash, it's the most I can compliment. Knee bombs, stun shots, and contact damage are all of his tools, a supposed war machine with the nuances of a toy truck. This is just fine. Really, the complexity from Chill Penguin earlier ruined my perspective of all of these battles. He's the standard that everyone failed to live up to. I don't need to try and eloquently describe a certain boss that will bombard players with hefty touch damage, since there's a really strange shift to a radically different gameplay focus. This tasks players with reading background lines with an insanely short time to grasp the situation. This is also while having to dodge spiders and having a weak point active for almost no time at all. I don't blame anyone that resorts to pausing the game in order to even know how the boss is going to act. There's also another boss that really only moves from left to right and charges up a big blast. having a very mediocre execution that doesn't capitalize on its uniqueness, since the challenge of moving in and out of it is so easily circumvented by sticking to the left for much of the battle. To cap it all off, the final 3 consecutive battles, one after the other, managed to be the most tedious part of this game by a wide margin. I really don't mind Sigma's purple pooch, but what could have been a strong conclusion to this game is a wet towel of a fight. Sigma's face prior to the wolf mech is one that's simply a boring climb up and down, over and over again, since both the spread shot and his saber swipe already incentivize players so heavily to stay off the floor. Not to mention this is only phase 2 of the final fight, which is necessary to beat on any subsequent attempts, happening most due to losing with the final form. This final phase did have the means to facilitate a cool ending, and there's some criticisms I can make on the overly demanding spit out attacks, or how they fail to be mixed in fun ways, but I'll just leave it at this loop here. A rather easy exploit that's just standing on one of the claws and waiting to slowly let off pink shots makes the mind wander. This is usually free of punishment. One can really stand here for extended periods of time, simply waiting to chip away and invalidating all sources of damage. Any failures that have spent sub-tank resources will have players suffer through a boring grind in a vertical shoot. No clue why the bottom isn't just stocked full of item pickups instead of tasking players to commit coitus with a hole filled with worms. I want to now move on to criticizing this game's presentation, as the brand new specs of this console generation allowed for what seemed like infinite possibilities at the time. Something as simple as just designing Mega Man X himself brought a challenge with the artist not being used to such creative freedom, coming off of the original Nintendo Entertainment System. If I were asked for my opinion on this game's graphics, I think I could provide more useful commentary by simply making comparisons than what I could gather from this game itself. The main reason is just that I have no strong feelings about the visuals one way or the other. The competition from other Super Nintendo entries serves as a good ballpark. I could list a decent amount of games that Mega Man X looks better than, and just as many that stomp and pound over anything Capcom could have managed at the time. One could point to an exceedingly elementary performance Mario World accomplishes with very simple backgrounds, foreground elements, and enemy animations in environments that fail to ever amaze or capitalize on the game's established premise of food themes, with enemy sprites being close to the sole redeeming factor. If someone unfamiliar with this game got told that it has numerous food-themed locations, it'd be quite a disconnect from the very standard aesthetics. Meanwhile, Contra 3 exists on the opposite end of the spectrum, featuring nearly unmatched hardware prowess, very detailed and fluid backgrounds with mile-long depth towards their horizons, also managing to handle a Herculean number of sprites and set pieces on screen, while mostly maintaining a rock-solid 60 FPS. Whatever intended spectacle is here isn't notably hampered by hardware constraints, and all of this is still being done with the base Super Nintendo cartridge, free of any additional performance chips. Mega Man X sits firmly in the middle of both camps. It's a visually competent game that doesn't impress or disappoint. I take no issue with how our cast of heroes and Mavericks are animated, but if I had a main qualm, it would be with the environments. So many of the backgrounds here lack animation and depth, looking rather flat and drab at times. Not all of them are created equal, but some screens should have been more than a plain black color. A general principle of adding little random knickknacks such as bolts, grates, pipes, and blocks were drawn to assist visual themes, although we see what could have been possible with more time and effort. I think we all know the obvious winner out of these. There was also an easy opportunity for more line or parallax scrolling, but confusingly, these simple tricks weren't implemented. I've taken the liberty of doing it myself to help convey what I mean. Nothing is close to pushing the hardware or testing the new tricks hard baked into the Super Nintendo's visual capabilities, but I can at least commend a few visual interactions into extra consideration. A small selection of enemies were given cheering or cackling animations done after they hit the player, in spite of their soulless appearances. Moments like these helped make enemies more than plain obstacles, and soften the blow for mistakes in a rather endearing way. Analogous effort was put into bosses reacting to different weapons, when something as plain as only taking extra damage would have been perfectly acceptable. It's visual flair that helps add charm and vitality to this rigid cast of characters. The visual beef up with new hardware let the developers also give the plain stage select a surprising amount of extra touches. All that was needed was a simple stage select with the 8 Mavericks around X like in earlier titles, but there were also strides taken to not only show off where each stage was located on a map, but also closer looks at each respective stage, and flavor text on robot specifications. This world was given some thought into how it was placed, and the existence of respective locations, even if the proper look at a Wily Castle equivalent is oddly missing. Also being another part of a greater whole, This game holds one of the best soundtracks, period. I find myself agreeing with the majority of how this game's soundtrack is some killer stuff. It's one of the few soundtracks of this franchise I found myself listening to outside of the game time and time again. It's a culmination of Japanese synth rock with a dominant overdrive guitar. I think if I really had to say anything negative, is that a sample very occasionally comes off as cheap or unoptimized, but it's something I have only managed to gather after who knows how many listens. A rather negligible blemish on a wonderful list of tracks. This music doesn't strive to be too atmospheric, or uses sound design to bring out more characteristic melodies or instrument use for stages, it removed from levels being underground, in the sky, or in a power plant, and instead has more concern with being audible Red Bull. Not like I'd strike the game for this though, this soundtrack achieves its goal very well. I suppose it helped to have a wide range of composers contributing. The music was composed by Capcom's house band team at the time, Alf Lyla, that had a wide range as seen with their contributions elsewhere. And while it was common practice to include such a thing, the addition of a sound test shows the developers were plenty aware of how good their tunes were. It's often touted that Mega Man X is not only one of the best games on its respective console, but also one of the best games ever made. While I can agree with the sentiment that this is one of the best generational leaps for a franchise, to call this one of the very best games to exist is something I still remain apprehensive about agreeing to. Some upgrades and boss weapons snap challenge in half sometimes. The dash and the huge freedom it provides being relegated to a specific, nondescript stage for no reason, the list of universally subpar boss fight designs that chronically underperform, and a climax that hits the opposite of a tall swan song on a gameplay front, leaves me wishing this game, like with most I've ever played, got the time it deserved. Nevertheless, I don't think the statement of being one of the best is one to get overly hung up on. Same going for the issues I just shotgunned off, since I still hold this game in high regard. It's not an avid favorite of mine, but it's got plenty of reasons to be remembered as fondly as it stands, since it manages to be an above average adventure that has much going for it in terms of replay value thanks to the variety in many camps. In particular how a player will experience individual growth, and also has ways of smoothing over the less than ideal design in unintrusive manners. Thanks to its successful rejuvenation of the Mega Man franchise at release, this would be the catalyst for its own proper series with sequels seeking to match and surpass the same status of the first.